AJ is good. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see everybody here. Before I get started, I would like to thank everybody for being here. I've been doing this research for about a year and a half now, and it means a lot to me to see people show up to listen to me talk about it. So a little bit about myself. So my name is Héctor Aizpurúa, and I'm a senior at UNC Chapel Hill studying music and history. And over the summer, I traveled to Panama and to various libraries in the United States, in Florida and Washington, D.C., studying the Panamanian culture and history. You want to change the next slide? Okay, so a little context on where Panama is and why it's so important in world history. So if you look down here, Panama is the last country in the Central American chain. Is the last Central American country right before South America, bordered by Costa Rica and Colombia. And as you can see, it's a very thin country. If you go to the next slide. And then, so the purpose of this lecture, we're going to focus on this particular area right here, which is the Isthmus of Panama, which is the narrowest part of Panama, which is important because it has allowed travelers for hundreds of years to come from the Atlantic Ocean down to the Pacific Ocean and cross into Asia and other parts of the countries to the west. So this is where the Panamá Canal was built, was all through here. And so this is where I did the majority of my research, was on this little strip of land right here. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so the main topic we're going to focus on for the first part is the dehumanization of Panamanians. So as I was traveling to these various libraries and doing my research, there was a common theme between American documents, European documents, and just foreigners who were traveling to Panama and their descriptions of the Panamanian people and the towns that existed in Panama. They summarized the people to be primitive and uncivilized. They talked about the towns being small little villages and huts and little roads and all these terrible things. In some other documents from high-ranking American officials writing about Panamanians, they described Panamanians as mosquitoes and buzzards, and they were a nuisance in that little kind of section of Panama. And reading about this history it was crazy just to read about all of it and seeing how they described the people in the land, especially knowing the hundreds of years of history that existed before. And if you can go back to the last map real quick. So a little bit of the history before all of the travelers and the influx of people came to Panama. So Panama City was originally established by the Spanish in the 16th century. And it had become a very important part in global trade and global commerce almost immediately. As when the Spaniards came, the indigenous people had showed the Spaniards how to cross from, it was a little bit more on this side, they showed the people how to cross from the Atlantic side, which the Spaniards were arriving in, and cross into the Pacific, onto the Pacific side. And this was very important for various aspects of the Spanish conquest of Latin America, including one of the more famous ones, the conquest of the Inca Empire. So Panama became a launching stage for the invasion of Inca. You can go back one more slide. So if you look, so the Inca Empire had started around here and went down into Peru and Chile. And so Spaniards would set stage here in Panama and then launch their attacks going down here and then bringing gold back up to Panama, crossing it through the isthmus, and then back over into Spain. And this led to a large influx of Spaniards and foreigners coming to Panama looking for the treasure of the Inca Empire, and also looking for trade, looking to cross through Panama and then continue west towards Asia. And this was in the 16th century. So then if you fast forward a few hundred years and we go into the 19th century. So in the 1850s, there was the American gold rush. And quickly, Americans realized that if you came down here from the East Coast, traveled to Panama, and then crossed through the isthmus and then went back up to the West Coast, it was one of the safest, wasn't all that safe, but for the time period, it was one of the safest routes to take to get up into the West. Much safer than crossing through the wilderness of the West, or also crossing all the way down into Argentina and back up. This led to another large influx of people in the 19th century, and also led to the construction of the Panama Railroad in the 1850s. And the construction of the Panama Railroad, once again, led to a lot of development and progress happening in the Isthmus, with many towns growing along the railroad, kind of like stations, like train stations, ended up growing large populations of people alongside the Isthmus. You can go to the next slide. So the railroad would have go back one more. You're fine. So the railroad would have went from Colón and then all the way down here to Panama City. And it was populated by towns. And then this little kind of part of water right here didn't always exist. So now it's called Lake Cancun. And it used to be what they called the River Chagres. I don't know if it still is. It was, at the time of its construction, was one of the world's largest artificial lakes, which we will get into later. It's very important to my research. But the railroad crossed right through here, and many towns started springing up all through what today is now the Canal Zone. Okay, now you can go to the next slide. Okay, so now it's kind of like a little bit of context and knowing like the influx of people and the influx of technology and people coming to Panama from all over the world to, whether it's conducting business or traveling or for whatever means, there was always people traveling to Panama. And so when I finally got to reading all these documents and I kind of referring to the demonization of Panamanians and seeing how they describe Panama and the people, it was crazy seeing how so much progress had been made in Panama, whether it had been by the Spanish or the French or Americans in the 50s. There was always something happening in Panama and towns that were growing to considerable sizes. So one of the first documents I found at Georgetown University was the Journal of Race Development, which was originally published in 1910, and it was an academic journal that focused on various aspects of foreign relations and international politics. This particular journal was published in 1914 and consisted of various essays, as you can see through here. But I want to focus on one essay in particular, which was Chad Efwick, who was a rear admiral for the United States Navy. He had published an essay in January 1914 titled "The Present-Day Phase of the Monroe Doctrine." And like a quick history on the Monroe Doctrine, it was used as kind of a justification for American intervention in Latin America. It didn't start like that. The Monroe Doctrine was originally used to keep European powers outside of Latin America, and then with Theodore Roosevelt, it started to become more of a way for Americans to intervene in Latin America, to kind of guide them as they see fit. So Chad Efwick in 1914 wrote this essay, and in his essay, he describes people of Latin America as largely non-homogeneous populations, or populations that were not pure white, and instead were a mix of indigenous and African descent. And in his essay, he describes the people of Latin America as handicapped due to their non-homogeneous populations, and that in order for Latin America to progress forward, they needed U.S. intervention to kind of help guide them and steer them in the right direction, which in his idea was eugenics, the idea that if we could whiten these countries, that they would be better off. And some of his descriptions were of Argentina, which was a predominantly white country, was a lot more economically successful than other countries. And so he argued that because Argentina was a predominantly white country, that if every single Latin American country was predominantly white, they would be much better off. And then on the topic of Brazil, he mentioned that Brazil was on its way to becoming a failing civilization due to their mixture of indigenous people and people of African descent mixing a lot. Get louder. It got a lot louder, right? Is it too loud?
It's good.
It's good.
I was like, it's really loud. Okay.
I know, but it's
But anyways, so that was Chad Efwick's essays, and I just want to go back to this idea of non-homogeneous populations being handicapped. So although he didn't necessarily describe Panama directly, these ideas of American intervention to help these non-homogeneous populations later became the justification for everything that was happening in the Panama Canal zone between 1904 and 1914, and even further on until like the 1970s when the United States returned the Panama Canal zone back to Panama. Go to the next slide. So we see here, this is a map of the Panama Canal zone, and then notice the date right here, August 1st, 1920. And we see this large lake once again through here. And you see the canal zone kind of goes straight and then veers off into the lake. So this would be important again later as we progress through this lecture. But originally, none of this was here, and it was just a river coming down from here, and that would kind of lead off into here. So this canal zone featured several large towns and the Panama Railroad. And as you can see here, one of the towns I will be talking about is this one, Empire, or in Spanish, Emperador, became one of the largest towns in Panama. A lot of the towns in the Isthmus ended up having a larger population than Panama City, Colon, and the entire province of Chiriquí, which kind of puts into perspective how large and how populated the canal zone was prior to U.S. intervention. So Empire, and there's another town that got semi-flooded up into here, which was named Gorgona, were two of the largest towns in the canal zone. And both of them were recognized as municipalities of Colombia, and then eventually municipalities of Panama when Panama got their independence. So these two towns had a very large population and a large political history as well, as because they were municipalities of Colombia and eventually of Panama, they had their own mayors, and they would have regular votes for who would become mayor and how they were being governed. Which brings us to the ICC and Coronel Gothels, who was the first governor of the ICC. And so the ICC stands for the Isthmian Canal Commission, which was the first governing body of the Panama Canal Zone. Let me switch to the next slide. And this is a picture of George Washington Gothels. So the ICC, when they took power of the Canal Zone in 1904, and they continued to exercise their power over the zone up until the 1970s, changing names a few times in there. But so when the ICC took over the zone, one of the first things they did was they began to segregate the people, much like Jim Crow laws in the United States. They separated the people, so the justification for the separation of the people were that Gothels described the people as natural carriers of diseases, and that in order to maintain and in order to stay safe and stay healthy, they needed a minimum distance of 1,000 feet between Panamanians and Americans working in the zone. And so this was a very common practice throughout the early history of Panama. Was high-ranking officials in the ICC, such as Gothels and Dr. Gorgas, who was another famous physician who had worked in Panama. They're the kind of descriptions of how the Panamanian people were spreading diseases, and they kind of faulted them for the spread of yellow fever and malaria. And then this led to the segregation of the Panama Canal Zone. So if we look at one of these pictures I found at the University of Florida, you can see they separated the people into two different categories, which were silver roll employees and gold roll employees. So gold roll employees would receive various amenities, larger pay, they had nicer living quarters. They also got free newspapers, like the Panama Canal Report, and various other newspapers. They received those for free, and they also had transportation back to their homes, whereas the silver roll employees did not have any of these amenities and were also less paid. And as you can see through here, the majority of silver roll employees were of African descent, whereas the gold roll employees were white Americans. And every aspect of Panama was separated into silver roll employees and gold roll employees. Okay, and then you can. So going back to the idea of Panama already having municipalities or larger cities, um, these cities were not recognized by the United States. So instead, what happened was when the ICC took control of Panama, they maintained the status of municipalities for a few years, up until about 1910, when the ICC decided to destroy or remove the status of municipalities from these towns and instead turn them into administrative districts. So these administrative districts were no longer governed by Panamanian governors. Instead, they were governed by high-ranking members of the ICC. And this is when they started to really implement these ideas of separation between the two, now that there were no longer Panamanian governors fighting for the rights of the people. And so, this was I had found this book that was published in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that was titled Our Jungle Diplomacy, written by William Franklin Sands. So in this book, he talks about the municipalities of Panama, and he relates these municipalities to American intervention. And that if it wasn't for Americans, these municipalities, which I had mentioned, had already existed for hundreds of years, did not exist until Americans came in and created them. So as you can see in the quote from, I think the first chapter of the book, he writes, "Soon they began to do exactly what Lane told them to do. They cleared the jungle around their huts, they joined their settlements by hard little foot trails, they built tiny electric plants, and a slaughterhouse or two. They learned how to dispose of these disease-fostering refuse and how to set up simple first aid and sanitation centers. They held town meetings on a primitive New England land. They created a smart market trade in wild fruits and garden stuff." So you see, like, a very common language of using primitive and simple, and once again, like, small huts. Can you go to the next picture? And so he described small huts and primitive, like, little foot trails and small sanitation. When if you look at this picture here in 1913 of, as they write, the village of Gorgona, you can see a much larger picture. And they were far removed from small huts. And these kind of towns here are very, these buildings right here are very distinct to ICC buildings. So the buildings further back here would have been belonging to Panamanians. But, so as you can see, this is very far from small huts and small little footpaths that Franklin Sands was describing in his book. And once again, as you can see, they describe it, the village of Gorgona, using kind of terminology of villages and huts. They also describe their houses as little native houses, or like mud huts. But once again, looking at the picture, it's very clear that that could have been further from the truth. Okay, so continuing with this dehumanization of Panamanians is postcards. I found various postcards that were written, that were bought by workers and would be sent back to the United States. These workers would write letters to their families on the back, describing various aspects of their time in Panama. And these were what Americans were drawing up in Panama, in the Canal Zone at the time. As you can see, this one is titled Alligator Bait on the Chagres River, Panamá Canal. Alligator preparing for lunch, Chagres River, Panama. And this one saying, honey, come down, I'm waiting for you in Panama. So it's almost comical how they kind of describe Panamanians. And this was, and like I said, on the back of these messages, it would be love letters to wives, love letters to mothers, writing back home, saying they missed America or whatever other like nonsense. And this was just very common in Panama, as they described how they viewed the people. So this is another postcard, and this one is titled Wild Natives and Their Home. Once again, going back to terminologies, wild. And on the back of the postcard, it says, Wild Natives and Their Home, Interior of Panama. 30 miles north of the canal, almost within sight and hearing of the industrious army, busily engaged in bisecting a hemisphere for Uncle Sam. The natives are wild, as witnessed by the photograph of the young fellow taken under difficulties in the shade of the almost leafless papala tree on the left. Very little consideration is given to the question of clothes. Once again, using natives and wild, but also see how they say 30 miles north of the canal, almost within sight and hearing of the industrious army busily engaged in bisecting a hemisphere. So Americans also had a tendency of removing Panamanians from the construction of the Panama Canal, writing that Panamanians were not sophisticated enough and were not intelligent enough to comprehend the complexity of the construction of the Panama Canal. Which, once again, thinking about the history of Panama, from the indigenous people aiding the Spanish in their Inca conquest to the construction of the Panama Railroad, the French Canal being built in the 1880s, Panamanians had aided in all of these kind of much larger endeavors. And then Americans removed them from that and kind of put them away from it. 30 miles north of the canal, almost within sight and hearing of the industrious army. Just completely removing them from the entire construction of the canal as if they were not living in the zone themselves and aiding in this grandiose construction. And also notice very little consideration is given to the question of clothes. So in Western civilization, clothing was seen as a sign of civilization. Much so that there was a professor, I don't remember what university he was from, but he had this theory that a population that uses clothing was more civilized and more developed than a population that did not. So he traveled to Brazil to prove this theory. And when he arrived in Brazil, he found the indigenous people fully clothed in Western clothes, in like European style clothes. And it did not help with his agenda or with what he was trying to write. So what he did was he had the natives remove all of their clothing, which then he took photographs of them naked. And those were the photographs he brought back to the United States and was showing at his university when he was doing his presentation. He showed these naked Brazilians and describing them as, look how they don't wear clothes, and there's no sense of civilization here. Completely wild. Which is, returns to this right here, how that was a very common way of thinking. Whereas it wasn't very, very common in Panama at the time for everybody to be naked. There were indigenous populations that still were not fully clothed at all times, but especially in the canal zone, it was those municipalities were very westernized already. Okay, go to the next slide. So now we can get into the depopulation of the canal zone. So the dehumanization of Panamanians ended up, and everything that I just mentioned, ended up becoming the justification for the depopulation of the canal zone. So segregation had happened first, and then after they had realized that they didn't want Panamanians to be all within the zone. And so towards the end of the construction of the Panama Canal, when they were already finishing up, around 1911, President William Howard Taft had declared an executive order claiming all land within the Panama Canal zone to be private land, and Panamanians were no longer allowed to reside within this private land, which led to the depopulation of over 40,000 Panamanians from the zone. Many of them never being given any sort of compensation for their homes, many of them having nowhere to go, which led to an increase of slums in Panama City and Colon, as many of them became squatters, just finding wherever they could to just settle new homes. Can you go to the next one? Thank you. So, in this picture here, you can see moving buildings in sections, partitions loaded in flat cars ready to be moved. Once again, going back to Corona, which is the town we saw previously. So you can see how they started removing houses from the canal zone and putting them in train carts, which then would be led to Panama City. And when these train carts arrived in Panama City, it was left up to Panamanians to find their own stuff and to find whatever pieces of their houses and put them back together. Once these were out of the canal zone, it was no longer their problem to help these people and relocate them. And also going back to native villages and native huts, you can see very far from little mud buildings, right? They had taken these down frame by frame and were relocating them to back to Panama City. Okay, now you can go back. So this is a picture that I took in Panama. This is showing that very large lake that I had mentioned before, the artificial lake, Lake Cancun, which like it was an artificial lake. So all of this land would have been above water and was eventually flooded for the purposes of the canal zone. And a very popular narrative came out of this, and this ended up being the cover-up story for Americans for the depopulation of the zone. So the flooding of Cancun, now you can go back to the picture of the canal zone? The one that's like 1920? So the American justification of the depopulation of the zone was largely centered around this lake right here. Many Americans wrote that these towns were being relocated because of the flooding. They had to move. Obviously, they cannot live underwater. So many towns, they wrote that many towns had to be depopulated and removed from the zone because of the flooding. But if you can look down here, completely untouched by the flooding of the canal zone. But regardless, this became the kind of prevailing narrative of what happened to the depopulation of the zone, with many Panamanians just being removed because their houses were being flooded. And even the towns within this flooding had fought to stay within the canal zone. Many of them did not want to move very far away. They argued that, yes, our towns are being flooded, but can we not move into these spaces here, or into the edges of the new lake, is what Panamanians were fighting for. And that did not happen. Many Panamanians, if they were not moved to Panama City, they moved to this kind of a early developing area in Panama, which is now much more developed and connected. But they were moved down here, completely removed from the industrious kind of like global commerce that was happening in the canal zone, and also from Panama City, which a lot of development was happening. So these people being completely removed and being sent over here destroyed many of their livelihoods. And also the agricultural land down here was not as rich as the land in the canal zone, which led many of them to die from either starvation or diseases, as water was not being ran through these towns. And once again, nobody really cared. Once they were outside of the zone, it was no longer their problem to deal with these people. Okay, and then you can move forward. Yes. Okay. So a lot of the documentation that existed, that still exists on the Panama Canal, is oversaturated by American documentation, with very little written by Panamanians themselves, which once again leads to these prevailing narratives of the flooding of Cancun being the reason for the depopulation, and the depopulation of the zone being very little known about. But one of the most important kind of materials that I came upon was this song, which is titled Coge el pandero que se te va, or Grab the Kite Before It Leaves. This song was recorded in the 1930s by an American recording company that had came down to Panama, and they were businessmen. They were far removed from politics, so all they cared about was making money, which is important because this song had to be one of the most popular songs in Panama at the time, in order for an American company to go out there and record it and distribute it to Panamanians. So this was recorded in the 1930s, but was most likely performed as far back as the 1915s and 1916. And in several documents by Panamanian musicians, they had described this song dating as far back as, I think, like 1914. So although it was recorded in the 1930s, this was written during the same time of the depopulation of the zone. And one last thing. So Coge el pandero, which tries to grab the kite before it leaves. You can interpret this as the pandero or the kite being Panamanian national identity and like their self-expression. So they're trying to say preserve Panamanian, like their identity as Panamanians, as they were not only losing their homes, but as we were touched on a little bit, they're also losing their history and their culture. And now we can play the song. And now I have English translations of the songs up here.
Victor 46927-A, matrix number currently unknown, coge el bandero que se te va, Grupo Ismeño.
For the sake of time, I'll play the whole thing. But it only goes on for another minute or so. But as you can see how the lyrics describe that they're not able to breathe anymore and how they were being forced out of the zone and they all felt like they had to immigrate, losing their sense of being Panamanian as they were being removed from their homes. And one thing I wanted to mention was that a lot of documentation, American documentation of Panamanians on the zone were that they did not understand the complexity of the Panama Canal, and that they didn't feel like the flooding was never going to happen, and kind of just describing them as unable to comprehend what was happening to them. And they also wrote that Panamanians were not going to be very affected by the flooding or by the depopulation of the zone because they didn't have large towns that had like their own history and culture. Instead, we're just removing these little huts and they can make little huts elsewhere, is how they kind of describe the depopulation of the zone. Where, once again, this song, which was one of the most popular songs in Panama in probably the 20s and 30s, paints a different picture. A Panamanians not only understanding their own place in history, but also understanding how they're being treated and seeing their own mistreatment and how this music became a part of how they fought back against that. So another important aspect of the population of the zone was there was one book written about all of this, which was by a Panamanian professor. Her name was Marcia Lasso, and she had published a book in 2019. And I thought it was a wonderful book, but from my own research, she sorely missed one spot, which was the Panamanian government's role in all of this as well, as they were not victims or saints in any way. But her being a Panamanian nationalist, obviously she kind of cherry-picked a lot of that information and did not add it in there. So I figured it was very important to also speak on how the Panamanian government also handled a lot of this. So can you go back to the map of the canal zone? So now going back to this map, there was a small town that existed on the River Chavez before all this was flooded that was called Limon. So this town, Limon, had existed on the river, and when the flooding happened, they understood, and they moved into this northern part of Panama along the new border of of the lake. And as you can see here, they're actually right here. It says New Limon. This is where they settled. And as previously mentioned, Americans did not own any of this land just yet. A lot of this land was later purchased. So when Limon moved from this area here to the edge of the new lake, they did that to kind of maintain their traditional lifestyle of being kind of fishermen and living along the waters. And Limon, when they relocated, they had stayed there for about 2 years, up until Americans approached the Panamanian National Assembly and had asked them to purchase this land for the sole reason of removing these people and acquiring more land within the zone and removing more people who had settled along all of this land here, which was at the time not American land. It had still belonged to Panama. So when Americans approached the National Assembly, many people in Limon, or as Marcia Lasso described them, Limoneros, went to go protest this. They approached the National Assembly telling them not to sell their land and to let them live there. And they were far removed from the Panamá Canal, far removed from any Isthmian Canal building or towns or anything they had created. And they had mentioned they were not harming anybody there. Protesting this to the Panamanian government, not even bothering with the American government as they knew it was a lost cause. So the Limoneros, writing various letters that still exist to the Panamanian National Assembly, went unheard, as the Panamanian government eventually sold all of this land to Americans. I don't exactly remember the cost, but they had sold the land, and Limoneros had to be completely removed from the zone once again, and the Panamanian government did nothing to help them. And not only that, the Panamanian government also aided in depopulation by telling Panamanians that they will be compensated for their loss, for the loss of their houses. And the Panamanian government, kind of going back into the people who relocated here, the Panamanian government had told them that they would go down into this area and build them docks and roads connecting back to Panama City and connecting everything through here, which never happened. When Panamanians moved throughout here, the Panamanian government kind of did a very half-assed job of doing so. They created a little mini dock, which nobody could really transport any large amount of goods to Panama City. They never had running water, and roads were never created connecting all of these towns until much, much later, leaving many of the people who lived through here to once again die of diseases or from starvation. And many of them had to kind of move closer to this area, which was at the time slowly being a little bit more developed. And not only did the Panamanian government aid in the depopulation of the zone, but they also aided in the destruction of their culture and their history, as Panamanians did not view, elite Panamanians, the governing Panamanians, did not view kind of lower class Panamanians as Panamanians. They did not view their culture as Panamanian culture. They did not view their music as very sophisticated music, which led to, go to the second to last slide. But which led the early nation building of Panama in 1904 was largely centered around kind of Western ideologies, bringing in European classical music and trying to teach European classical music to Panamanians instead of their traditional music. It also led to theaters being built that would premiere operas from all over the world, but never Panamanian music itself. And one last thing we will touch on, you can go to the next slide, is Anufo alias Madrid, who was the president of Panama in 1940. And this was also very common throughout early Panamanian presidents and how they viewed the people of Panama. And we can see it here in his quote from his inauguration. He writes, "We all have to admit that there is a serious ethnic problem in our country, which began with the opening of the Panamá Canal when the United States government brought in great contingents of elements of color." So you see how he also is refuting, is kind of building on off these ideas of non-homogeneous populations handicapping his country. And he also ties in the United States with creating this problem, which was also a popular sentiment happening in Panama with a growing like anti-American sentiment. So he was kind of tying in the two of them to gain popularity in Panama. And he stayed popular in Panama for many years, up until he fled Panama during the reign of Manuel Noriega in the 80s? 60s.
With the military dictator.
Yeah, so when Noriega, thank you. So when Noriega came in, he was expelled from Panama. But we see these ideologies going all the way back from 1940, almost 30 years, where he was very influential in Panama, and these ideas were being spread all throughout Panama. Okay. Now we can go into, if anybody has any questions. I know it was a lot of like information and stuff. I don't know if anybody has any questions about anything. Yes.
So the song you played us,
Yes.
you made the point about the people from here that had the equipment that came down, recorded it, and distributed it.
Mhm.
It was unclear to me sort of whose side that was on per se. What I mean by that is that like, so they're recording it and they're distributing it to make money from the Panamanians, but they're in so doing distributing this protest song
Mhm.
amongst the people, but they're from here, and do they realize that like, what I'm saying is that what's unclear is like, in what interest is that actually?
So like I had mentioned before, when there's not a lot written on it, but the way I interpreted it was businessmen being businessmen, and they saw an opportunity to make money. And around this time, Victor Recording Company had traveled to several Latin American countries, and there were like lots of anti-American protest songs being recorded by Victor Recording Company and being distributed throughout Latin America, which just goes to show like the popularity of these songs,
Right.
because they were making Victor Recording Company money. That's kind of like the end goal at the end of this. They could care less if they hated all Americans anymore. They just wanted the money from the record.
Right.
Any other questions?
So a lot of foreigners were brought in to build the Panama Canal.
Yes.
Okay? So they were not discriminated as much as the native Panamanians.
So for the sake of like the lecture, I didn't talk about all of the different ethnicities and races that had come to Panama, as there were Asians, Europeans, Americans, a lot of people of African descent from the West Indies. But to kind of answer that question is when the canal zone was finally depopulated and no more Panamanians were no longer in the zone, the U.S. had created small towns separated from ICC, from the Isthmian Canal Commission towns, which were West Indian towns. So towns for West Indian workers to continue living in the zone. So we see West Indian workers who continue to live in the zone after depopulation had their own towns, but it was also not in the sense of we're giving workers a home. It was kind of a social experiment for Americans to see if they could civilize these non-homogeneous populations. Yes.
I don't know if you touched on this, but what was like the Panamanians' initial reaction
To the depopulation of the zone?
to the building of the canal?
Oh, to the building of the canal. I cannot exactly tell you from the perspective of Panamanians living in the Isthmian Canal, or from the canal, I'm not entirely sure, as there's not a ton of documentation. The Panamanian government themselves were highly for it, and a lot of Panamanians who saw this as an opportunity of money were highly for the building of the canal. So much so that going back as far back as the 1880s, when the French had attempted to build a canal, the French had declared it an international project where every single country was going to benefit from the Panama Canal. So they had invited diplomats and representatives from all countries, including Panamanian and Colombian representatives, who went to France, and they were also fighting to have the canal built in their country and not in other countries, because there were talks of building through Nicaragua as well. They wanted to build canals through there, and Panamanians were fighting to have it in their country as they saw the economic benefits. As for the people living in the canal, those documents were probably pretty hard to find, but I'm sure research to be done there. Any other questions? We have no questions. Okay, so I did prepare a very short piece that I'm gonna play, and it is, so the piece is titled Regalo a Dora de Zarate, and I chose to play this piece because, so Regalo is like a message, and then Dora de Zarate is an important Panamanian folklorist, or as we can kind of like see them today, like musicologists. She had, her and her husband were from the province of Los Santos, and they did a lot of work in reviving Panamanian culture and preserving Panamanian culture, whether it was writing about it academically, teaching it in universities, and also transcribing the music. So I want to finish with this song as, you know, I talked about the dehumanization and the erasure of their culture, and I wish I had more time to talk about the preservation of the culture in the 50s. There was a huge shift where Panamanians were now seeking to preserve their culture and preserve the music of Panama as much as they could. And a lot of Panamanians went into the provinces of Chiriquí, which were more rural provinces removed from the construction of the canal and like Western civilization, or like the Western influence, in an effort to like preserve all of this music. So this final piece was written by Gonzalo Brenes, who was a Panamanian pianist and composer, who wrote this like as like in homage to her for preserving all of this music, and he himself did a lot of work all the way up until his death in 2001. A lot of his work was very influential for mine, as a lot of the stuff that he transcribed and preserved, he was the only one who did it. So it was really, I thought it would be fitting to end with this short piece. And it is not the entire piece. I got a little ahead of myself, and it's like 6 pages long. I learned like the first page and like a little bit of the second, but I thought something was better than nothing. And be on the lookout in the future as I might play an entire recital of like Panamanian music that has never been recorded before, which is cool. My papers. Yeah, thanks for going. The entire thing here one day for sure. All right, thank you so much for everybody being here.
Thank you.